Let's talk about practices. Essence has a standard, it's got a common ground, and it's got a language that we use to describe the practices. So here they are on the screen. The kernel and the language are agnostic or independent of any particular practice. That means any practice we want, we should be able to describe using the Essence language. And even though the Essence standard and the Essence language, and in fact parts of the kernel, came from software engineering, and we talk about having a software system, it's also the case that many practices don't need to work with software at all. So we've got practices around innovation, around leadership, around teams. None of them are specifically about software. So we've got a really powerful language that we can use to describe all kinds of practices. So they kind of sit on top of the kernel. And then we've got practices that we can combine together. And when we take practices together with the kernel, that gives us a method. And we can have methods that are collections of practices, for example, for in-house development, or we could build a set of practices that are, an external thing like, say, Scrum at Scale. There's 4 or 5 practices that are independent, can be used on their own, but bring them together, and you've got practices that describe Scrum at Scale. So let's look at this picture again in a slightly different way, and we'll describe what a practice is and help you understand it in a little bit more detail. The Essence definition of a practice is this: a repeatable approach to doing something with a specific objective in mind. And we describe a practice using the Essence language, and then we relate it to the kernel. So if we think about the standard, we know that the standard has these common ground things. And when we have a practice, we tell it which part of the common ground does it help with. So for example, if I've got a practice about testing, I'll relate it to the alphas in the kernel that are to do with the software system, and I'll relate it to the activity space in the kernel that's to do with testing the system. So we've got that coherence and that connection. Look at the definition again: a repeatable approach to doing something with a specific objective in mind. So there's some really nice clues in there as to the power of a practice. It's got to be big enough that it's got some specific objective in mind. So we want practices to be doing something useful, but it's a specific objective. It's not all objectives. We don't want practices to do everything. So practices are small enough to be useful, and they're big enough to be useful as well. And that kind of combination is nicely described using this phrase, which has come from the flow system and complexity thinking: reusable element of coherent granularity. So this phrase didn't come as a way to describe Essence. It was about assemblage and disassemblage, but it describes an Essence practice really well. It's repeatable, which means reusable, and coherent granularity. It's got some independence, it's got some purpose, but it's not got so much in it that it's not granular, and it's not got so little value that it's got no purpose. So it's a nice way to think about it. Practices are big enough, but not too big, not too small. Some examples then of practices are on the screen there. So we got the ones you will definitely have heard of: Scrum, Kanban, use cases, user stories. But we've also got practices around cybersecurity and architecture, psychological safety, goal identification, Wardley mapping, and then some innovation practices around business model innovation, human-centered design, which you might know as design thinking. So quite a range of practices. And if you think back to the standard, we've got things around the stakeholders and the customer and solution, and these practices spread across that, but mostly they don't spread across everything. We haven't got a practice here which is, develop software. We've got practices around test, around requirements, around architecture, around continuous deployment, around innovation, and that's that coherent granularity idea. Here's another picture of the practices. We like to use a hexagon, kind of honeycomb metaphor, and you can see a mix of practices there, some of which are the famous ones that you'll recognize, some of which are standard practices that AGI has created, for example, Agile Architecture Essentials, things like that. Some might be a bit more custom or esoteric, and that's just a small example. There are many more. So that's how we get practices and what they look like. And for some people, a practice can be useful on its own. You do not need to understand the detail of Essence to get value from a practice that's been written using the Essence language. You don't even need to understand a great deal about Essence to be able to get value from the cards that have the practice descriptions written on them, because you can just read the card, and yes, there might be some pictures that are parts of the language, or there's a color there for a reason, but you can still get value from the card without needing to understand Essence. So in that way, Essence practices are very inclusive, they're very accessible, and actually that accessibility is part of the benefit of Essence and how it's one of the reasons why Essence is easy to learn and easy to teach. So there's a set of practices. There are many more, and there'll be many more that you can create yourselves using the language.